Hey y'all, welcome back to Leadership Rewired, or if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm Dr. Vanessa R. Brooks, and I'm so glad you're spending a few minutes with me today. Before we jump in, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. We drop new episodes every week, and I promise you, we're talking about the leadership stuff nobody else is addressing. The real stuff. The research-backed, neuroscience-informed, been there, lived it kind of leadership conversation. So hit that subscribe button and let's stay connected. All right, so today we're diving into something that honestly changed my entire understanding of leadership, vicarious trauma. Now, I know some of you just heard that phrase and thought, okay, that's a clinical term. That doesn't apply to me. I'm in corporate, I'm in ministry, I run a nonprofit. But listen, if you lead people who are dealing with human suffering, crisis, difficult clients, organizational stress, or high-pressure situations, this conversation is absolutely for you. And I'm not just coming at this from research, though we're definitely going to talk about the neuroscience. I'm coming at this from lived experience, both as a pastor who sat across from people in some of their darkest moments, and as a supervisor in human services where I led teams who were carrying heavy cases. So let's talk about what's really happening when you care deeply and lead well, and why your best leaders might be struggling in ways they can't even name. So let's start with what vicarious trauma actually is, because most leaders have never heard this term. Vicarious trauma, also called secondary traumatic stress, is the profound shift that happens in your worldview, your sense of safety, and your neurological functioning when you're repeatedly exposed to the traumatic experiences of others. It's not just feeling sad about someone else's story. It's your brain literally rewiring itself in response to absorbing other people's trauma. The research defines it as the cumulative, transformative effect of working with survivors of trauma. Your brain doesn't distinguish between trauma you experience directly and trauma you witness or hear about repeatedly. When you're supervising someone who's working a domestic violence case, pastoring someone through grief, or leading a team member through a crisis, your nervous system is activated in similar ways. Here's what makes vicarious trauma different from compassion fatigue and burnout, because they're related but distinct. Compassion fatigue is the exhaustion of your empathy. You care so much for so long that your capacity to feel compassion becomes depleted. You're emotionally numb. Burnout is systemic exhaustion, usually from unsustainable workload, lack of control, and inadequate resources. It's organizational dysfunction manifesting in your body. Vicarious trauma is neurological transformation. Your brain's threat detection system has been fundamentally altered by exposure to others' trauma. You're hypervigilant. Your worldview has shifted. You may develop intrusive thoughts, difficulty sleeping, or emotional dysregulation, not because you experienced the trauma, but because you absorbed it. And here's the correlation with caring for teams. The more empathetically engaged you are, the higher your risk. The leaders who care the most are often the most vulnerable. Let me explain what's happening neurologically, because when you understand the science, you stop blaming yourself for not being strong enough. When you hear traumatic content repeatedly, your amygdala, your brain's threat detection center, becomes hyperactivated. It starts scanning for danger even when you're not in session with that team member, not in that pastoral counseling appointment, not reviewing that crisis case file. Your hippocampus, which helps you contextualize memories, can become impaired. This is why leaders experiencing vicarious trauma often have intrusive thoughts or can't leave work at work. Your brain is struggling to file these experiences as someone else's trauma, and your prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, decision-making, and emotional regulation, becomes depleted from chronic activation of your stress response system. This isn't weakness, this is your brain doing exactly what it's designed to do when exposed to threat, except the threat isn't yours, it's absorbed from the people you're leading and caring for. Y'all, I lived this firsthand in pastoral ministry. I remember sitting across from person after person, week after week, sexual abuse survivors, people in domestic violence situations, families in crisis, addiction, grief, trauma stacked on trauma. And I would leave those conversations and go preach, lead meetings, make strategic decisions for the organization. But what I didn't realize was happening, my nervous system was in a constant state of hyperarousal. I started having intrusive thoughts about the stories I'd heard. I would be in a grocery store and see something that reminded me of someone's trauma narrative, and my heart rate would spike. I stopped feeling safe in the world because I had absorbed so much evidence that the world wasn't safe. And here's the part nobody talks about. I felt guilty for struggling. These weren't my traumas. I wasn't the one who'd been abused or assaulted or devastated by loss. So I thought I had no right to be affected, but that's not how your brain works. Then in my work as a supervisor in human services and social services, I saw this playing out in the teams I led. I had clinicians and case managers carrying caseloads of children in foster care, families experiencing homelessness, domestic violence survivors. And I watched brilliant, compassionate professionals become shells of themselves. They'd start missing deadlines, their clinical documentation would decline, they'd become cynical or emotionally detached, which looked like they didn't care anymore, but was actually a protective mechanism their brains had developed. As their supervisor, I was holding their vicarious trauma and the organizational pressure to maintain productivity. I was in leadership meetings defending why my team needed lower caseloads while simultaneously absorbing their trauma exposure in supervision sessions. This is the hidden cost of caring for teams in high-stress, high-empathy environments. You're not just managing workflow, you're metabolizing collective trauma. Now, whether you're in corporate leadership, organizational management, or ministry, if your team is dealing with difficult customers, organizational crisis, layoffs, or any form of human suffering, you need to understand this. Vicarious trauma doesn't show up in your performance metrics. It shows up in turnover, in sick leave, in decreased innovation and engagement, in leaders who used to be brilliant suddenly making poor decisions because their prefrontal cortex is compromised. Most organizations don't have a framework for this. They offer employee assistance programs and wellness apps, but they're not addressing the neurological reality of leading people through pain. So, what does the research tell us about mitigating vicarious trauma? Let me give you practical evidence-based strategies. First, neuroplasticity-based regulation practices. Your nervous system needs daily recalibration. This isn't optional self-care. This is neurological hygiene. Bilateral stimulation, like walking, drumming, or EMDR-informed techniques, helps your brain process traumatic material instead of storing it in fragmented ways. Second, contained exposure. If you're in supervision, pastoral counseling, or leading through crisis, you need structured boundaries around when and how you absorb others' trauma. Your brain needs time to metabolize. Back-to-back trauma exposure sessions dysregulates your nervous system. Third, peer processing with people who understand. Isolation amplifies vicarious trauma. You need other leaders who get it, not to vent, but to co-regulate nervous systems. This is neuroscience, not networking. Fourth, organizational acknowledgement. Leaders need permission to name vicarious trauma without it being pathologized as weakness. Create a culture where leaders can say, that case is affecting me neurologically, without fear of being seen as incompetent. Fifth, strategic disengagement practices. Your brain needs evidence that you're not always in threat mode. Intentional activities that engage different neural networks, art, music, movement, anything that shifts you out of hypervigilance. Here's what I need you to hear. If you lead people through pain and you're struggling in ways you can't quite name, you're not broken. You're experiencing a predictable neurological response to caring deeply while leading well. Vicarious trauma is the occupational hazard of empathetic leadership. And the solution isn't to care less, it's to lead with an understanding of what's happening in your brain and implement evidence-based strategies to protect your nervous system, because your team needs you functional, not just faithful. All right, y'all, that's what I have for you today. If this episode resonated with you, do me a favor. Share it with another leader who needs to hear this. And make sure you're subscribed so you catch every episode of Leadership Rewired. I'm Dr. Vanessa R. Brooks. Let's lead differently.